Cammy Watkins is Executive Director of Inclusive Communities. She's an Omaha native who graduated from Omaha South High School. She graduated with a Bachelor of Arts from Cornell College in Psychology and Vocal Performance. Cammy has almost 20 years of experience working with non-for-profit organizations, ranging from affordable housing to performing arts administration. The opportunity to work with many different facets of the business world have provided Cammy with vast insights into the business needs of organizations. And now I'm really excited to pass to Cammy, and she will introduce her guests as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Melissa. So I'm excited. We'll be doing, and I'll just go ahead and share a little screen here and can advance past my own personal bio. So I'm excited to have with me today, we're going to, in this presentation, two gentlemen from BCT Partners. So we have Dr. Randall Pinkett with us, who is the founder and managing partner with BCT. And I just wanted to put up, I always feel like never know whether I should read people's bios. And this is just a small snippet of both of their bios. And then Peter or Pete York, who is the principal at BCT Partners. And I'll give them a chance to explain a little bit more about what they do and the tools that they're putting together. But essentially our focus today is really on giving you some tools around analyzing data and working with data through a lens of equity, as well as some real life examples that Pete and Dr. Pinkett will be providing for you, and a tool that they have. So I want to start first with myself in explaining a little bit about a toolkit. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the Annie Casey Foundation. If you are, so they have a lot of really great information, particularly if you work in child welfare or juvenile justice. I highly recommend that you utilize their newsletter, as there is a ton of resources and information around that. And a lot of what Josie spoke about today was really crucial. And so I grabbed a couple of her screenshots of some data points, and we might kind of explore those a little bit around how do we understand some of the root causes of those disparate outcomes that the data shows us. But one piece that I really want to start out and share with you all is the concept of VUCA. How many folks are familiar with that concept? Okay, a few. So VUCA is a term that was utilized first in the military, and it stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the same way that we look at how we're managing data, this is the same way in which the world is working right now, that we can no longer continue to assume that that cause and effect relationships are going to be valid or recognizable for all problems. We can no longer assume that. We have to start to understand that there are multiple factors that impact what B is going to be, and therefore it's going to have to change how we come across solutions. And in that comes the way that we do our factor data analysis. So this particular tool that was introduced, I'll go back to sharing my screen. This tool was introduced in 2021, and it's a toolkit from the University of Pennsylvania's Actionable Intelligence for Social Policy. And this toolkit that I really hope will be useful for you all offers a blueprint for integrating data with an intentional focus on racial equity. So realistically, their end goal is that ethical data use will empower agencies and community members at the same time. There's this really beautiful opening statement that we have here on it that I want to read it for you because I know it's too small to see, but the statement was written by the toolkit authors, and I think it's really poignant to our topic, so just give me a space to read it for you. It says, societal progress is often marked by the construction of new infrastructure that fuels change and innovation, just as railroads and interstate highways were the defining infrastructure projects of the 1800s and 1900s, the development of data infrastructure is a crucial innovation of our century. Railroads and highways were drivers of development and prosperity for some investors and sites, yet other individuals and communities were harmed, displaced, bypassed, ignored, and forgotten by those efforts. As railroads and highways both developed and decimated communities, so too can data infrastructure. At this point in our history, we can co-create data infrastructure to promote racial equity and the public good, or we can invest in data infrastructure that disregards the historical, social, and political context, reinforcing racial inequity that continues to harm communities. So building data infrastructure without a racial equity lens and understanding of historical context will exacerbate existing inequities along the lines of race, gender, class, and ability. So with that, one of the key takeaways that we really want, and that I'm hoping that you will use this toolkit, and we'll provide this with you in your resources afterwards, is that if you are working or on developing your data, and so all of your information, both that we get from the census or other resources, if you are in the work of developing it, how you use your data and processing it, or your responsibility for analyzing that data, please let this toolkit just be a starter guide for you to be more intentional about racial equity and equity in general when utilizing the data. As the website or this toolkit shows, like deliberate efforts to address structural racism, institutional racism, and unrecognized bias has to start to happen. We've probably heard, or you may have heard, that when we look at how data is collected, how data is used, that it's inherently biased through its system design. And so what we can start to do is be more intentional about the ways in which that we're utilizing it, and recognizing that there are serious consequences if we continue to utilize these flawed bias processes for data development and data use, or just data interpretation, that will then only exacerbate the issues that we already see in terms of inequity. So the room for improvement mostly stands in that data analysis stage, and that's generally where we all come in, that we're looking at those places in which the social problems that we're trying to change, we're usually looking at just one-dimensional data. And we use that to propel our agenda, when we actually have to start looking at them from a more understanding that the world is complex, ambiguous, and uncertain. We have to have more multiple data points to review. And I wanted to just highlight one particular activity. So there's multiple activities within this toolkit that help agencies better create data infrastructure to incorporate racial equity. But I want to bring your attention in particular to activity 3, which is about identifying the root causes through factor analysis. So this particular activity is relevant to this topic that we're doing in this breakout session. So within the activity, the toolkit defines both causal factors and root causes. And so just the quick definition of the causal factors is conditions that contribute to an outcome. So if causal factors are not present, the outcome would be different. And this tends to be what most of us will look at. We're often looking at those causal factors, which aren't necessarily the full problem, but it's contributor. So sometimes when we say if there's an illness, we're treating the symptoms, not the cause. The root cause is the primary factor that contributes to an outcome. So if the root cause was not present, the outcome would not occur. And this goes on to give an example of like a social problem where there were low third grade reading scores in a community. And it says, like, for example, a community grappling with low third grade reading scores may rush to implement an intervention such as academic-based summer programming. So I want to just ask for, and you can just do it through a thumbs up on your screen with your reactions, how many folks, for those of you who currently use kind of specific data points to determine what your solutions will be to an issue for your particular organization, does this example resonate for you, that you went around like low reading scores and you kind of come up with an intervention to address that? So just thumbs up using your reactions. Yeah. So a few of us, for sure, that this is something that definitely resonates in terms of how this impacts or how we're using data. So do we now, with the second paragraph, it goes in to say, though, using factor analysis of systemic issues, support stakeholders in using data and lived experience to uncover the causal factors behind an issue so that the solutions can go deeper. So in this example, it says they use factor analysis could lead to a community to address, led to talking to the community to address low third grade reading scores by addressing the inequitable distribution of resources to support early childhood development in feeder neighborhoods before investing in downstream interventions. So what they did there is that they took the opportunity to look around what besides just those low scores was creating or causing these different issues. So do we see the difference in the outcome and the solution from when they sought out the factor analysis in addition to for the causal factor? And this is the group participation portion of the session. So feel free to come off mute and just kind of give your answers. Oh, and I should share that we work with middle school students, so I'm okay with awkward silences. But I would love to hear how much deeper do you, or what difference do you think the solution that came from looking at the factors with the factor analysis versus just looking at the data point to the solution?
Hi, this is Alicia. Sorry about that timer as soon as I come off mute. I would say that it's the difference between taking a stab in the dark and maybe addressing the problem versus getting to the heart of the matter and doing something that's really going to make a difference.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alicia. And this is beyond to others too. How much deeper do we think the solution could be if we also sought out the root causes of this? So didn't just look at this one causal factor, but looked at the full environment. What other data would they need to gather to identify what is the root cause of this disparity of the low third grade scores, reading scores?
I feel like it could go a lot of different. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
So for this, hi, I'm Mira. I think for to improve to low reading scores, I think that also depends on the family situation and how much the child is getting time from their family parents. What kind of situation that child is living, that depends a lot. That factors out a lot, the situation, because most of the time, if parents do not have time, they do not force compel their child to even for doing the home assignments at home. They do not have technology actually to sit at the table and do so family income, and all the other situations varies a lot, contributes a lot in the low reading.
Yes, and so you started to kind of touch on that. Technology is a piece that can be an incoming factor on that. You talked about resources within the family, income. So all of those pieces, and if we're looking at root causes, is the socioeconomic status, and if we even go into some of the information that Josie talked about with the lower income earners, and then we also going even deeper into breaking down the median incomes by race, that pay equity factor, would that have a factor on these lower income or the lower reading scores in third grade for a family or for a youth?
Yes. That's the biggest factor, actually, I would say that, it contributes a lot.
Absolutely. And so if we think about, particularly here in Nebraska, if this example was specifically here in the work that we're doing in Nebraska, and we're in the education field, And we recognize that there are certain parts, like say in Omaha, we'll utilize Omaha as an example, and that there are third graders in the Omaha public school system, because one of the pieces is that we have 5 different school districts within this state, which does conflate kind of the issues and the concerns. And we can even overlay those aspects of data. If we're looking at third grade reading scores, particularly within OPS elementary schools, and we recognize that majority of the population of OPS students are, the racial demographics look very different from the rest of our public school systems. With our public school systems in OPS, the highest racial group is Latino or Latina, and then it goes African American and then white. So then we compound the factor that majority of the, and let me pull up, I kind of screen grab Josie's screen. Oops, I have to restart my PowerPoint. I grabbed Josie's little screen of the income disparities just because I felt like it would be valuable to share with you all when we're having this discussion. Oops, screen too. Okay. So you can see here, this guy. If we also know that, so majority of the families in the OPS are Latino or Latina led households. We also know that the third grade scores are lower. Well, if we also then look at that 67% of Latino males, their average income in the state of Nebraska is $31,000, and 56% of Latina females, they're at $25,000 annually. Is that possibly a contributing factor to those lower resources, lower access, chances of not having technology in the household? Because we also, that was a discovery that we made. So if I am a person working in education and I'm trying to address disparate outcomes within the education field in elementary school, is only addressing the students' after school program, or even just addressing the student in the school, going to eliminate the problem? It's going to be like church. Just come on, pop in on in with that answer or your thought process.
Well, the home environment as well is going, even if they have access after school, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have support and access at home. Because if mom and dad are working 1 or 2 jobs, then you don't have people there to reinforce the fact of getting homework done, those types of things.
Correct.
So it's the family dynamics as well as the school situation that they're exposed to.
Yes. And so then when we think about the solutions that we come up with is only addressing this situation in a school environment going to actually solve these problems? The answer is no. So sometimes what we're going to need to start to shift, if we're truly going to address disparate outcomes in our that are occurring for problems in our community, we're going to have more holistic solutions. We're going to have more collaborative work that's happening. So if I am specifically within the education work field, I also have to be partnering with people in the socioeconomic and public health if I'm going to address the issues that are happening within my third graders in the classroom. And I know that that's completely outside of the way in which we function, or typically right now how we've set up our systems, but we know that each system is linked and connected. And when we finally start to look at root causes, mostly what we end up doing is trying to point the finger at, well, I can't address this problem and I can't do that because that's outside. And we're not asking people to go into that mission creep or broadening your scope. It's about how do we do more collaborative, collective action to support and address problems. Because if we are only doing those causal effects, we're only going to change the outcome in that one situation, and we're not going to eliminate the outcome. And many of our missions and our focuses are to eliminate poverty, to eliminate homelessness, to eliminate the pay gap. But we're not able to do those things if we're only addressing one symptom of the problem. And that's the key piece when we start talking about using that data to identify those root causes. Go ahead. Oh, sorry, I thought I saw a hand raised. And I want to pass it over to Dr. Pinkett and Pete to share the tool and the resources that they've been utilizing and working with in different government agencies and places in which they're involved through BCT partners. So Dr. Pinkett, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Thank you, Cammy. And just a time check. Do you need us to wrap up at 1:45 or sooner?
We'll at 11:40, yeah, 1:45, so that we can do a little Q&A before we go back to the full room.
Okay, that's very helpful, very helpful. Good day to everyone. There's a few familiar faces I see out there. I consider Omaha like a second home for me. So it's good to be in this space. Cammy, I very much appreciate two things. First, your framing around understanding root causes, which is something that we're aligned on. And second, for the invitation for us to be a part of this session and to piggyback off of the dialogue that you've already sparked around data and community and impact. I'll just be very brief. I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague, Peter York. I want to just frame what Peter will present and connect it into what Cammy just shared a moment ago. The work we're doing at BCT is both practical and it is also methodological. Practical in the sense that we're developing very real tools for very real people to do work that leverages data, but methodological from the standpoint that there are certain principles that we lift up that Cammy in many ways highlighted. And so what Pete will present is it's as important to understand the underlying principles and methodology as it is to understand the practicality. Said differently, the process might actually be more useful to know than the products. And that process is one that lifts up at minimum 3 values, and Pete can expand here. One is causality, understanding the cause of what happens. And Cammy, you just gave eloquent voice to this idea of root causes. There's been a lot of debate in social science and now data science of can we get to understanding cause outside of a random control trial? And we're developing tools that allow us to develop understanding of cause. So causality is number one. Second is transparency. There's lots of ways to skin the data cat, some of which you can have no idea what's happening under the hood. That's not one of our values. We're very deliberate about being able to interrogate what's the algorithm doing, what's happening under the hood. So only when we interrogate it can we have transparency to understand what are the underlying assumptions that went into the algorithm or went into the model. So causality, number one, transparency, number two, and third is equity. That's the third value. Understanding what works for whom, which is another definition of equity, what works for whom. And getting more granular to be able to have that conversation beyond just disaggregating, say, by identifiers, but developing models that really get to the core of understanding what works for the individual and not the average person, which is what most research studies endeavor to understand, what works for the average. So with that as a preamble, causality, transparency, and equity as values, I'll now pass the baton to Peter York, our Chief Data Scientist and Principal at BCT. Pete, the baton is yours.
Terrific. Thank you, Randall. Well, it's going to be wonderful to be able to springboard off of Cammy's setup and conversation around root causes and all that you were sharing. I think that's a great framing. And thanks, Randall, for the framing. I'm going to share my screen and just walk through and really try to hit those key components of the principles and the practice and this idea of the 3 frames of causality, transparency, and equity. And I'll try to hit those notes, and Randall chime in as we go too if you want to elucidate something as we're going here. Let me share my screen. I am going to, which one is it? It's this one. And I'm going to hit present. Tell me if you all can see. You can see it, right? The full, awesome. Okay.
You're good to go, sir.
All right. So one of the things I want to share is that I want to orient us to the conversation that we're going to have now is around when we think about using data to understand root causes and thinking about causality, transparency, equity. I want to come back to something that was discussed earlier today. I attended the earlier session, which I thought was fantastic. And there was a question that was asked. So I'm going to pose this first as a question in terms of framing what I'm going to share. So there was a question posed if we were to ask why Nebraskans leave the state, and we assume that the data say they leave the state for better wages. Okay, let's say that's our what a lot of the data seem to be pointing to. The key here is that on average, this is true. And I'm bringing this word in that Randall was just highlighting around some of the issues with the use of average. When we roll up the data, on average, it is true. But a more precise answer is that it depends. For example, why people leave clearly depends upon their education level, their local job opportunities, wage opportunities, available of housing, family circumstances. And these are all affecting the whole population, but not the same ways, not on average. We can't average all those out and create an average solution or an average approach. These things really do depend on a lot of what we called what about factors. What about this and what about that? When we say they're leaving for wages, everybody naturally says, well, what about all of these other issues? So to be more fair, equitable to the people whose lives are affected by the answers we use data for these questions. So the data, how we understand and analyze that data, we need to think about it and really understand we have to be more precise and equitable in that it depends. And so what we really need to do is we need to look at unique causes and conditions for different groups, disaggregated groups of Nebraskans, and look at these factors differently. So we're not trying to say the one size fits all solution, policy, or program. What we're doing is getting more precise about really what works, and then really evaluating and assessing if everybody is equitably getting what works. And for that, we're also looking specifically at groups that have been disadvantaged, left behind, or left out. And so from that standpoint, it's taking us to a new place where what I'm going to share now is around an analytic approach that we've been now developing over the past decade, big data science approaches that are transparent, focused on equity, and look at causality. We call it precision analytics. And I want to share with you, and I'm going to share a concrete example that uses American Community Survey data and IRS data. The thing I want you to hear throughout this, as far as the principles go, is the idea that it's time, and we have the tools now to begin to look at root causes, not for the whole population, but for all the different populations within Nebraska, and understand their unique needs and how their unique circumstances affect what they're doing. And we now have the tools. So oftentimes we want to roll everything up because we don't like complexity, but we all know one size doesn't fit all. And so how do we address it and accommodate that complexity or meet people where they are? And that's what we're going to talk about here. So this is just a slide that's sharing the past decade's worth of work that we've been doing here at BCT in a number of different fields, including really defining, designing, developing, and testing precision analytics approach of causal modeling. And I'll tell you what that is, with a number of organizations, government agencies, others on all kinds of different fields. And that also does include areas with respect to employment. We're working with the National Science Foundation to really advance these tools and techniques. We also have a number of publications that have really been both peer-reviewed publications and business publications and funder publications. And you can look those as those just to learn more about the approach. But let's jump right into, so what are we talking about when we start to disaggregate and understand? So at its core, there's a methodology now that is available to the research community that comes from the data science world, but really needs to be shaped for causal modeling from the social science world, if you will. And the steps in the process really are, we now have data we can access, prepare, and get ready, and we can bring all kinds of data sets together. We're in a whole new data world. For example, all the open source American Community Survey and other census data. There are so many numerous data sets out there, public and private, that can be brought together to examine things more closely and understand more specifically, equitably, what works for you. The heart of the precision analytics method is training machine learning algorithms, transparent algorithms. We aren't using black box algorithms. These are algorithms that can be reviewed. Think peer review, which is a part of the scientific method. We use machine learning algorithms to find natural experiments in history for similar groups of people. And I'll get more into that in a moment. But we really are first finding those like you in your circumstances and finding all the kind of variances in what's been tried, and then looking at what of those variations cause the result we're looking for. And the key here is equitably. So I'll talk about how we address that in a moment. And then the third thing we do is produce and automate results. And the key here is to understand that where the technology is taking us is we don't have to do this manually over and over again to get these answers. We can actually use technology to start to automate the whole process, from accessing, cleaning, analyzing, modeling, producing the results, and spitting it out into a Tableau dashboard or a Power BI dashboard, which is what we saw examples of, fantastic examples of how data should be visualized in the previous session. So let's talk about these steps. First, we find, access, and prepare data sets. The key is we can now bring data sets together. Data sets around individuals, like the PUMS level data from the Census Bureau. We can use communities, which is data that's at like the ACS data, the census tract group, county or state. And we can bring it together with other data sets. There are research efforts right now going on that also bring other big data sets, including social media data and other data to answer questions. Okay, so that's the first step, broadly speaking. And there's a lot there, obviously, but the heart of what I want to share with you when it comes to understanding root causes is really this, number two, is using machine learning to find these algorithms to help find natural experiments. And machine learning just allows us to do this and study things that would take us months to years to do in our traditional manual ways, but we can leverage that technology and speed and power of machine learning algorithms to find all those variations that occur, those natural experiments that happen in history, evaluate them and look at what worked equitably. The steps in this process are as follows. One, and this is a cornerstone, finding similar groups of people that make people similar in relation to their circumstances, capacities, situation, condition, that make them more or less likely to do something that will achieve the outcome we want, okay? The key here is we don't start the modeling and this work by matching based on factors that should not be a factor for selecting why some community or individual or family experiences a program or a policy. So if there is no reason why race or gender should not be a factor for selecting someone or a community or organization for a specific treatment or program, then we would not match on that. So we're matching on those conditions and circumstances that we know affect how people interact with and engage with the kind of strategies that will achieve the outcomes we're looking for. That's a cornerstone piece, and I want you to hear that we're not matching intentionally on factors that should not be a selection criteria. The second thing we do is we find those within those match groups who got something or didn't get something. And I'm going to give you a concrete example. So I'm just trying to give you an overview of the steps, and then I'm going to give you a concrete example that I think will bring this to light even more clearly. But imagine within each of those disaggregated groups, those mass groups, people like you, communities like you, organizations like you, we find all of those in the data set, and then we look at all the variations of programs, policies, whatever may have been implemented, and we try to find those who got something or did something and those who did not. These are counterfactual models So algorithms can find all those counterfactual experiences, comparisons, okay? The next thing we do is we compare those results. In the research world, we try to see, are there statistically significant differences based on those combination of interventions and treatments? The powerful thing about machine learning is it allows us to actually make all kinds of complex comparisons in ways and within a much shorter time window than we could before, okay? So there's our evaluative piece. Now, you heard on the front end, we don't place groups, organizations, et cetera, into groups based on factors that should not be selection factors. That helps us reduce that issue of sort of identity factors or other factors that should not be, that are more biased factors or socially biased factors. So what we do is, once we do learn what works based on the factors that make sense in relation to what we're striving to accomplish, at the end of this, these are the bookends, the equity bookends, is we then evaluate, did everybody who were different identities, intersections of diversity factors, for example, did everybody get what works for their group equally, fairly? And this is where we begin to then assess how this is the issue of equity. And we talk about equitably. And the third step in this process is to produce and automate the results. And this is where the technology is taking us. And we can show some examples of that, et cetera, but I'm going to go through this example to now show you kind of what this looks like on a very practical question using some data sets that you'll be familiar with. So I'm going to skip this really quickly. So let's look at a research question, okay? A question that says, does access to employment services, think nonprofit community-based organizations that provide employment services, does it improve community well-being over time? So this is an example. We're going to look at this question, and we'll show you, and we've actually done this study nationally using precision modeling. So I'm going to walk you through the steps. So remember, the first step is to find, access, and prepare data. We can take the IRS 990 data, which tells us how much programmatic output in dollars every type of organization in the United States is producing, as long as they're over $50,000 in budget. So we have all that data. We can roll it up and geospatially put it all together, and we did, to determine how much is getting produced for all these different services. And we're going to look at employment services down to the census tract. And we actually had geospatial data figure out kind of your service area. We combined that with the American Community Survey data, because we know there are factors from the ACS data down to the census tract that we want to look at. And specifically, we want to look at a number of factors that roll up into what we call an area deprivation index, or a social determinant of health metric. And it's a statistically validated metric. And we can look at this relationship between employment services from the IRS 990 data, and we can look at it in relation to community well-being, and we're using area deprivation index. Okay, so we're looking at this causal model to answer, again, let me remind you the question: does access to employment services, local access, improve community well-being? Okay, so the second step is the matching step. We have to match, train machine learning algorithms to find matched comparison groups of communities. When we say communities, think census tracts, of which there are over 70,000 in the US. Okay, so the algorithms would find that there are certain types of census tracts, metropolitan working poor communities, that are unique with respect to their access to employment services. So this is a unique group that all has a very similar type of experience in terms of how much they'll be able to access. So metropolitan working poor communities are going to access very differently than, for example, rural communities, than, for example, suburban communities who have lots of public transportation or whatever the case may be. So we first said, okay, out of all the 70,000, let's match all the communities that have very similar traits in terms of what they will likely be able to say they can access employment services. So we've matched them all. The second step is now to go through and say, okay, so now let's use the knowledge we have, the future knowledge. So we have longitudinal data. We know 4 years from now, and we have all that data, we can look and say, well, let's look and see which of these same matched communities, metropolitan working poor communities, so we're controlling for that. These are the it depends, or what about? These are the factors that are the it depends factors. We have this one group, and we can find those in the country, communities that are very similar, but some had enough access to employment services, others had none or very little. And we can see that red-green here, okay? So we find all those communities, and then we can evaluate, and the machine learning algorithms can evaluate what happened to community well-being, area deprivation index over a 4-year period, when some census tracts within a matched group had access to employment services while others did not. And here's what we were able to find. We were able to find that overall, controlling for all those factors of transportation, socioeconomics, all those, rural, suburban, urban, we controlled for all that, put everybody into their groups, all these communities into their groups. And once we looked at all the data across the board, we could see that having access to enough nonprofit employment services created a statistically significantly higher level of ADI after 4 years than when you did not have access. So this tells us something, but remember, it's sensitive to who you are. And we can actually disaggregate and look at every type of community and understand how important employment services are to those communities. Okay. Now here's where we get to the equity piece. Remember that other piece where we then evaluate, did everybody get access? Everybody within these same groups get access to employment services equitably? And so here we get to a place where, I don't know why it's not going here. Okay. So now we're going to look at this question to evaluate the fairness. And we're going to look at communities that are more white, meaning communities that have that are more than, I think, 3/4 of a standard deviation, but they have more white than the county. So census tracts with more white representation than the county, and compare those to communities that are more people of color. They have much fewer proportion of people of color compared to the county they sit in. So we look at these two groups. We ask the question, we should see that they're all getting equal access to employment services, and there should be no statistically significant difference. But in fact, there is a statistically significant difference. 1 in 4 white communities have access to enough employment services, while 1 in 5 communities of color do. So this in the end can produce some really tuned and tailored, sensitive to the different groups. And after we roll that up, and it's not about averages, it's about looking across everything. We're breaking everybody up into disaggregated groups with the old, it depends, or what about me, or what works for me kind of model. And that's the beauty of that precision approach, like precision medicine. But once we do roll it up, as we look at it all, we can still derive answers. We believe more equitable answers as to what really matters. And we can see here all the different services that nonprofits provide and understand how they uniquely contribute to community well-being, controlling for a lot of socioeconomic and other factors by putting the people, communities into different groups. We can also show where there are inequities in being able to access different services. So let me pause here. Randall, I'm gonna pass to you and see if you wanted to say something, and also perhaps reconnect it to some of the framing that you provided at the beginning. But I want to pass it your way, and then if we could pause for questions, and then we can also demonstrate what a tool that's built on this looks like, if that would be helpful.
So yeah, so Pete, I think we have 15 minutes for Q&A if I heard from Cammy correctly. So I think we've got a good 10 minutes before we go to Q&A. So I actually would, believe it or not, throw the baton back to you. I'd love to get a demo in before we go to Q&A. I think folks would love to see some live tools.
Terrific. Well, let's do that. So I'm gonna move to our demo of what we call our Equitable Impact Platform, which I just want to share really quickly. All the causal modeling you just saw in here that was looking at, do communities have enough services? Imagine, in addition to the evaluation findings that we just shared, that you can do and look at this and be much more tailored to the unique needs of different types of communities and look at equity before we answer these research questions. Now imagine being able to take that and being able to apply it to a tool where you're not just getting these research findings you see on this page, which, by the way, given earlier session today, made me rethink our visualizations and maybe needing to improve the visualization of that a little bit with some of the data viz approaches that were provided earlier. But nonetheless, this is kind of the research view you're looking at right here. Now imagine being able to take the same causal model and turn it into a tool that allows a very different type of interaction, where we can look at individual communities and understand what they have enough of. We can begin to look at communities within our state or in our region and be able to find different communities that actually don't have enough certain resources, are struggling with specific issues, are more diverse. What I'm going to show you is a tool that is now in place, built on these causal models, that is now taking this from a research tool that is presenting the findings you see here and creating an applied tool. This is the applicability tool that brings in all that equitable causal modeling, that precision analytics modeling. And I'm going to show you what a tool looks like that then derives from that. So we're getting two benefits from the same model. This is the power of some of the current data science and big data science tools and techniques in bringing this together. So I am now going to stop temporarily sharing that screen and go to my other screen. So bear with me for 1 second. Can you all see my screen?
Yes, you're good.
Okay. So if you're seeing my screen, I'm actually going to make this a little bigger. If you're seeing my screen, this is a tool that we built where we conducted a study looking at different issues of equity in the nonprofit sector in the Pittsburgh region. And this is a nonprofit organization that provides capacity building and technical support to nonprofits throughout the Pittsburgh area, and actually a 10-county region. There are a number of funders and others who are involved in this research study, and this tool has been built for them. This tool is being built so that the community, funders, intermediaries, and even the organizations themselves can better understand how better to target and tailor to improve the equity of how nonprofit funding, capacity building gets distributed better to organizations that serve communities where there's the greatest needs, disadvantages, and inequities. So what I'm going to show you is this tool where we go to what's called a community map. So I've already highlighted here employment. You're going to see a region with census tracts in Pennsylvania, in the Pittsburgh region. There's a 10-county region here. You can see all the counties. Matter of fact, I'm going to intentionally select, I've selected employment. So we're going to examine access to employment services for the communities in this 10-county region. But imagine I'm a funder, or I'm somebody wanting to learn a little bit more about Allegheny County, which is where Pittsburgh is located. Okay, we can select Allegheny County. Now, what this tool is also doing is intentionally asking you if you'd like to learn or identify communities, census tracts, with particular challenges or particular factors in place. So we could select things like this well-being is a scale based on area deprivation index. And for all of you out there, it's a standardized metric that's used for one type of a social determinant of health. And we use what's in the research literature. So we use the same scales. But you can see we've kind of labeled the scale. And let's say we say, I want to learn which communities and how much employment services they're getting for more of our deprived, in decline, and fragile communities. The map has already found those communities. And let's say we know that there are inequities. In Pittsburgh, they already know a lot of the data, and they know there are inequities for communities in particular where there are more people of color. And so they will select more people of color to find those. Now, this brings you to a map where you can now look and investigate any one of these communities and learn a little bit more about it. So you take a look at this community in Arlington, this neighborhood of Arlington. It can tell you the population of this census tract, gives you some information. When it comes to employment services, what you'll see here is there's high access, meaning they can get there. They can drive there within a 15-minute drive. And we've used Google Maps API and other things to basically calculate all the service area based on a number of factors, not the least of which is transportation times in terms of getting places. Okay, so looking at access is a big important part of this, especially with respect to equity. So they can access, they have high access. There actually is good community giving, very high. When I say community giving, it means there are funders that fund in the region. There are volunteers, the community volunteers a lot. There's government grants, individual donors, philanthropy, it's all there. However, what you'll notice here is for this neighborhood of Arlington, they don't have enough employment services. And what enough means is in the causal modeling, we've been able to determine for this type of community, remember the matching, for this type of community, how much output, programmatic output in dollars is needed in employment services to contribute to improving area deprivation over a 4-year period. And it may only be a few points, but we can prove it statistically significant. We can see that this community, from that causal model, that equitable causal model, we can see that this community does not have enough employment services. And let's say we wanted to say, okay, well, we know that. Can you show me the organizations, the nonprofits that service those communities? And so we could then go right to our nonprofit map. With all those filters in place, we can see that there's really, we have one organization here, and we can look at that organization and learn about its organizational capacity, its budget size, and be able to learn more about that organization. And so what this is doing, if I back up for a minute, and let's say I go back to my previous community map. Now let's broaden this out a little bit. Let's say we want to pick the entire region. So we'll select all in this case, okay? And let's say we want to include satisfactory just to broaden a little bit. If I go to the nonprofit map, what's going to see is you're going to see a map with all the nonprofits that provide employment services. We can even see a list of those organizations. And just like we did causal modeling for the area to see how service output contributes to well-being, we also did causal modeling to look at what are the revenue and expenditure models and financial indicators that predict, again, with different groups of nonprofits, predict their likelihood to sustain and grow over time. And that's where you see that capacity score. And so you can quickly be able to find these organizations, look at who they are, and begin to learn a little bit more about them. And so this is a tool, an applied tool, sitting on top of causal models, although it may not be apparent, because the use case is to really help donors and funders find nonprofits servicing the communities of need and being able to then look and see and learn more about them. So we can redirect resources, all based on that whole causal model that allows us to find the organizations in those communities where there are disadvantages and disconnects. So I'm going to pause there. I see there's a lot of chat. It seems like there's some chat stuff going on. And Randall, I'll throw it back to you.
Yeah, that's actually me in the chat, Pete. What I did was I provided links to 3 public examples. One that Pete just demonstrated. He just demonstrated the work with was that Rochester Area Community Foundation? Was that PACE?
No, that was PACE.
That was PACE. Okay, so the first link I provided, Program to Aid Citizens Enterprise, was what Pete just demonstrated. That's the first of the 3 links. I also provided 2 other examples in the chat, one from Rochester Area Community Foundation, and then one from the Northwest Pennsylvania Job Connect. All 3 of those examples are built off of the same platform, combining the national data sets that Pete referenced with local data sets integrated to help tailor and customize it to local needs. But underlying all 3 is the same methodology of causal modeling to understand what works. I see some questions in the chat, which we'll go to, but the last thing I'll say, and we'll go to the questions, is know that the unit of analysis that Pete has presented is where a community vis-a-vis a census tract is the unit of analysis. What works for that community? We can deploy the same methodology for people. In other words, the unit of analysis is a case versus a place. And when it's a case, we can look at what's the right mix of mental health interventions for a person? What is the right set of interventions for a person or for a child to achieve permanency in foster care? Same methodology, different unit of analysis, same kind of insights. Prescriptive, what should you do with the individual or the community? And then predictive, if you are to follow that prescription, that recipe, what types of improvements can you anticipate? So I'll moderate the questions, Pete. The first one here is from Sandy Griffin. Thank you, Sandy, for getting the Q&A party started. What are all the data points that go into defining a tract, as in decline versus prospering?
Yeah, so it's the area deprivation index, which is kind of standardized. There are we use what's called the Sing scale. And it's a scale that has been developed and is used widely in the research world in terms of there are 17, I believe it's 17 indicators from the American Community Survey that all are scaled, so weighted. They cover areas like unemployment, housing, poverty, what am I missing? Jobs. There's a number of different dimensions. It even covers things like plumbing in terms of housing and crowding and everything else. There are 17 indicators. And the research literature's got a lot of at least associational research that proves that all of these 17 indicators are highly correlated, if not somewhat predictive, of long-term health and well-being of the residents of different communities. So that's what we're using. And so the way we scale it into those categories was really a way to break it into levels through normalization with the intent of user friendliness, because the concept is pretty broad and throwing a lot of numbers at people we did not find was very as helpful. They like to be able to have those kind of labels to help them think about how to select.
Excellent. Thank you, Pete. Next question is from M. Singh. Says, this is very interesting. Wonder what local organizations can have access to this tool. Is this tool open source?
So what you're seeing is not open source per se. They're going to, we partner with organizations who then are going to make it available locally. We want to partner with organizations because we believe if this is going to be really helpful, it's going to be important that there are some local intermediaries, funders, and partners to be able to really apply this and make it come to life within their communities. So we've built a big data architecture. We have our equitable impact platform architecture. We put all this data together. It's feeding in real time. We build all the models. We update the models, by the way, every year. And so it's going to be something that we will be backboning, and we're looking for different partners and how they want to use it. So it's not open source broadly. However, we do have some open source offerings. So if you were to click on the link, I think, did you provide the link to CUSP, which is a tool we developed during COVID? That's open source. But some of these other details in here, we partner with others.
Yeah, so I'm going to drop into the chat a fourth example, a tool that we developed for free in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic called the COVID Urgent Service Provider tool, also known as CUSP, C-U-S-P. And that is a freely available tool for locating charitable organizations, and it marries it with COVID data, so you can kind of triangulate around need, prevalence of the pandemic, and organizations that could serve those communities. So I'll put that in the chat next.
And I was
while you're putting that in the chat, I'll go ahead and read out the next question that we have here for you, Pete. What was the name of the 17 indicator scale? We are developing an equity dashboard along similar lines and use 5 indicators.
Yeah, it's the Area Deprivation Index, or ADI. I've just sent you all a link to a good resource to learn more about the ADI. If you go there, you can see there, it'll take you to another link that says go to Area Index, actually the Neighborhood Atlas, which uses ADI. So you'll see there, you can learn a lot more about ADI, which uses, again, 17 indicators from the American Community Survey. We are beginning to refine the metric, because one of the things that we feel pretty strongly is not included in it and other social determinants of health that are out there, is actually trying to get a measure of equity and inclusion. And so we think that it has income disparity as a part of that scale, but it's not directly incorporating racial inclusion and equity into it. And so there's we feel pretty strongly that while we're doing the causal modeling that allows us to evaluate fairness, there can be an argument made that when we are determining social determinants of health, diversity, equity, and inclusion should begin to be considered and integrated into these scales that everybody's using as a value statement, if you will, that DEI is something that should be a part of when we think about community well-being and health.
Well, and in the absence of a couple other questions, I'll just pitch out to you, Pete and Randall. We're starting to see a shift in, and it's not always the most popular shift for our data friends, but that using lived experience as part of your analysis, because we know those aren't always as statistically significant, but in order to us to ensure that we're ensuring equity in the process, we have to start doing that. So what are your thoughts and kind of suggestions and tips that you give around that?
Yeah, so we're intentionally reaching out, and we've begun talking with groups that are really advancing on the technologies and methodologies to collect lived experience, and be able to even ask the questions that those with lived experience let's call them lived experts, and engaging them much more. The problem is right now in the research community, the evaluation community, the big data community, we're passively kind of extracting data. And what we're not doing is capturing enough of that lived experience work. There are organizations and places that are doing that. And the more that lived experience data can be brought in. And by the way, also bringing lived experts into the sense making from these tools, to the design of these tools. It's going to be like critical, and we're hungry to form those partnerships, because you can see we've started. There's not lived experience in here, except for the fact that obviously the American Community Survey is a survey of families, et cetera, but they didn't design the questions, right? They're not involved in the analysis. So at some point, we really need to raise the bar, and it's front and center for us at BCT. It's reflective of our mission, and so we're very intentional about trying to reach out for partners along those lines.
Yeah, and I can give I know you got a question, Melissa, a really quick example, working with Annie Casey Foundation, which you mentioned earlier, Cammy, looking at building some models to understand what are the factors that lead to juveniles in the juvenile detention system finding facilities that best meet their needs. And so we're actually building those models with juveniles in detention facilities to understand what are the salient factors through their eyes, not through the eyes of external partners, so that we can then, to Pete's point, kind of help to model and make sense of how we build the algorithms that are reflective of their lived experience. But Melissa, you had a question too.
No, that's great. Thank you. And first, I'll just share, and we saw this message just come up. We'll be wrapping up in 5 minutes. But I do have a question too. And I'm kind of curious, like, Cammy, thinking about, from a nonprofit standpoint too, and, like, as we're working in our communities and maybe, coming up with some research questions, and we, as nonprofits, we may not always have access to, great AI technology or other things where we might need some external help. So I'm kind of curious, like, how, if we're coming up with a question, what are some tools available to us that we might want to look at, or what are some of the questions that you're asking when you're trying to answer a research question or begin, especially keeping some of the holistic factors in mind. I know that there can be a lot of different factors going into a situation. So how do we begin to narrow and address some questions when we may not have a lot of resources as nonprofits?
Yeah, and I think that the key is that as organizations like what we're doing begin to build the sort of the big data backbone and the analytics capabilities, it's going to be very easy then to partner and support a lot of that work. The way we're building these architectures is to bring every possible feature or variable from every data set that we know. We also have our team is actually made up of social scientists and data scientists collaborating. And this is really where the future lies. It's got to be a collaboration. I always say led by the social scientists. This is where my heart is. I'm a 25-year evaluator. I was a frontline social worker for the homeless. So my background is always like from the social science perspective. but we have to, first of all, build kind of the data architecture, the data repository, the data infrastructure. But for those organizations that are doing that, nonprofit or for-profit or government, it's then being able to partner such that the researchers, the academics, the policy analysts and others, can really begin to then leverage and answer a lot of these questions that we're talking about. So in theory, the platform we've built, you could ask and answer a number of different questions. Randall was talking about the fact that we did some work with the Workforce Board in Pennsylvania, the Northwest PA Job Connect Workforce Board. Well, we connected many other data sets, PA data sets, work stats data, et cetera. And the point is that once all those data are there, the key is developing a process with researchers who want to leverage that platform and build what we call sort of our theory of change feature set, which is kind of like, what's the outcome question? What are the questions, the features and variables that will guide that research, and then collaboratively figure out how to work from there. I think there are a lot of those out there like us. We're trying to basically build the backbone and make sure that we have enough of the sort of social science review and everything else in terms of subject areas to put stuff together and then partner with others to do that. There's no reason to keep reinventing the wheel, and there's a lot of work to get the architecture built.
Well, and I would add on to that, simple, also to what Josie had mentioned, all data is valuable, all data is important.
Yeah.
So we can start with knowing that if you don't have the resources to get a tool like this, you start with the data and the tool accesses that you already have, which is the census data, your own individual tracking. Especially our frontline agencies, you do have access to start getting that lived experience data. And we know that our friends at like BCT Partners, those are the types of partners that they're trying to connect with, so that, and our big data users need. So if you start with your own baseline and the relationships there, but I think it's about just, what's the question? What's the problem that you're trying to solve? Just any question of, why is it that all of our students are failing here? Start there and then start to use the data that exists.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cammy. And I'll just mention we're about out of time. We're running up on probably 30 seconds here, but really want to share. Thank you all so much. Any final quick thoughts for the group before we go back to the big room?
We had one question about how all the factors can be analyzed by tracks. We might have to just get that to you later if that's a bigger question to answer in a minute.
Yeah, we probably do need more than a minute or whatever. We have 15 seconds. We're about to get cut off. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cammy. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you all.
Thank you all so much. And we can make anything available later on for access to. So thank you. Appreciate your time today.